On this quiet night, as the noise withdraws from the corners and minds begin searching for something warm to accompany them before sleep, we invite you on a different kind of journey, a journey through time, to a civilization that breathed poetry and wrote with light, then quietly faded into the lost paradise, Al-Andalus. Before we begin, take a moment to press like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I create. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always a pleasure to see people joining us from every corner of the world. And now, let's turn off the lights and open the doors of history. On a warm morning in a distant summer, small ships anchored on the southern coast of the Iberian Peninsula. They carried men whose faces were unfamiliar, yet whose intentions were somehow known. At their head was Tariq ibn Ziyad, a man who had come from the opposite shore, from a desert land that knew no fear and had no patience for waiting. In the year 711 AD, Tariq carried no material treasure, but something deeper. An idea. Europe at that time was drowning in chaos, torn apart by weak kingdoms, crumbling roads, and famines that stole people's dreams. The newcomers, however, were the sons of a civilization that loved with confidence, a civilization stretching from Damascus to the Atlantic Ocean. In their eyes, Al-Andalus was more than a land. It was a blank page on which everything could be written. The soldiers marched through the fields. They did not fight the cities much. Their gates opened before them, out of fear, admiration, or a longing for stability. The conquest was swift, but it was not barbaric. Mosques were built, roads were cleaned, laws were set. The people of the southern villages did not understand the Arabic language, but they understood safety. They realized that those who came carried not only the sword, but also water, warmth, and order. In the cities, craftsmen began to work again, markets pulsed with life, and schools opened for both young and old. Along the banks of the Guadalquivir River, a dream began to grow. In the mornings, people went to their work, and in the evenings, they sat under palm trees, listening to stories from the East. Stories that were not fairy tales, but lessons of knowledge, wisdom, and experience from nations that had shaped history. With each passing day, Al-Andalus wore a new color. That conquest was not a fleeting occupation, but a long-term planting, and what was sown then continued to grow for centuries. Houses began to shine, water flowed through small channels inside gardens, and people began to dream. The beginning was quiet, like a small plant pushing through stone. But over time, that plant grew into a tall tree that shaded all who lived beneath it. The first branch that sprouted from it was a city that would, within decades, become the beating heart of Al-Andalus. And here begins the great story. The story of a city that loved light and despised darkness. A city called Córdoba. In the heart of Al-Andalus, on the banks of the Guadalquivir River, Córdoba began to breathe. It was not an ordinary city, but an idea turning into stone. a wish taking root in the soil. Over the years, and specifically in the 9th century AD, Córdoba became the capital of the Umayyad state in Al-Andalus, and one of the greatest cities of both Europe and the Islamic world. In its dewy mornings, the streets were washed with running water. Yes, water that flowed through clean canals between houses, entering gardens where sunlight reflected off the orange trees. Even the houses were remarkable, not towering palaces, but simple white homes, bright from within, equipped with advanced drainage systems unknown to Europe at that time. In Córdoba, hundreds of schools were born, some small for children, others vast for scholars. Education was not exclusive to Muslims. Jews and Christians studied there as well. While most European cities were drowning in illiteracy, Córdoba produced thousands of manuscripts every year, collecting them in libraries that resembled museums. It is said that at the height of its glory, the great library of Córdoba held more than 400,000 books, while the libraries of Paris and London barely contained a few hundred. Córdoba overflowed with ink, paper, and ideas. In those silent halls, scholars studied medicine, astronomy, engineering, music, and philosophy. Here, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, interpreted the works of Aristotle, responded to Plato, and debated the concepts of reason and revelation in clear Arabic that flowed like water through the city's channels. Here too, Ibn Hazm wrote The Ring of the Dove, one of the most delicate books ever written about love, not only from the angle of passion but from a deep human understanding of emotion. Poetry lived in the corridors like doves. Ibn Zaydun wrote in Córdoba some of the most beautiful verses ever composed about love and loss. The city did not merely gather words, it created a whole life from them. At night, the city glowed. Streets were lit with lanterns, and the call to prayer rose from tall minarets. The nights of Córdoba were calm, yet full of quiet movement, of ink upon paper and reflection behind stone windows. Córdoba did not boast of its glory. It simply continued forward with confidence. It knew that light does not need to shout to be seen. It only needs to remain steady. And so, while Europe slept through the darkness of the Middle Ages, Córdoba dreamed of light and made it. From its gardens, its books, and the footsteps of its scholars, another marvel emerged, the palace of Madinat al-Zahra. In the outskirts of Córdoba, on a dewy morning beyond its walls, the earth was prepared for a new dream. It was not just a palace for governance, but an architectural statement of a civilization at its peak. In the year 936 AD, Caliph Abd al-Rahman III ordered the construction of Madinat al-Zahra. He wanted to build a capital worthy of glory and a bride worthy of Al-Andalus. Legend says the name Al-Zahra was given in honor of a woman the Caliph loved. But Al-Zahra soon became more than a name, more than a city. It was a stone painting stretched along the mountain slopes, overlooking plains and fields like a queen watching her kingdom in silence. Builders came from the east, calligraphers from Damascus, engineers from Baghdad, until the place became a distillation of Islamic art at its finest. Verses of the Quran were engraved on the stones, arches drawn with precision, and windows were not mere openings for light, but works of art where sunlight entered, as if entering a dream. Madinat al-Zahra was not a lifeless seat of power. It was a living center of thought, administration, and culture. In its long halls, delegations came from across Europe, dazzled by the colors, the flowing water, the soft eastern furnishings, and the organized gardens accompanied by the gentle sound of fountains. Even the marble came from distant lands, a testament to the reach of Al-Andalus. Al-Zahra housed a library too, where books were copied and arts and sciences were studied. It was not open to the public. It was a school for the elite, princes, commanders, writers, translators. There, art met authority and reason met beauty. Philosophers debated new ideas, rulers listened to the counsel of scholars, and the elite read the works of the Greeks, now transformed into Arabic by master translators. In the gardens, water was organized with astonishing precision, flowing from one basin to another, weaving through flowers and slipping between plants. Everything was measured: length, distance, color, even shadow. For Al-Zahra was not merely a place to live, but a space designed to create harmony between man, place, and time. But glory does not last. Less than a century later, in the mid-11th century, Al-Zahra was plundered and destroyed during civil wars. Only ruins remained, but what survived in memory was enough to tell how refined Al-Andalus had become, even in its stones. From among those ruins, new threads of knowledge were woven elsewhere, in a place called Toledo, which would become a beacon, gathering the people of learning in the heart of the Iberian Peninsula. On a hill overlooking the Tagus River rose a city unlike any other Toledo, an ancient city of stone walls and narrow paths that nevertheless embraced the light when it faded elsewhere. After becoming part of Al-Andalus in the mid-8th century, Toledo began to transform from an ordinary city into a center that hungered for one thing: knowledge, translation, and human coexistence. What distinguished Toledo was not its high walls, but the hearts of its people. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side. Relations were not always easy, but they were enough to spark a quiet dialogue among minds. Ancient books were brought from the east, from Baghdad, Aleppo, and Alexandria. Copies of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Euclid, rewritten in Arabic, then revised in Toledo and retranslated into Latin. Through Toledo, the West came to know the zero, algebra, Islamic astronomy, and medical sciences that surpassed what they had inherited from Rome. Knowledge was not imposed there, it was offered, and reason was the judge. Thus, light passed from the east through Toledo to Paris, Rome, Barcelona, and even Oxford. Language in that city became a bridge between worlds. Arabic words entered Latin and settled in European dictionaries, their origins forgotten. Words like algebra and alchemy. They crossed from mouth to mouth, from book to book, in silence like light slipping into a dark room. Toledo was not merely a place, it was a moment. A rare moment when differences met upon what they shared, the love of knowledge and the search for truth. That moment was brief, but its influence lasted for centuries. Without Toledo, modern Europe as we know it might never have risen. And as the sun set upon Toledo's walls, the Andalusian dream still glowed in the south, in another white and dreamy city, a city like a poem, called Granada. Between white mountains in southern Al-Andalus, beneath a warm sun that felt like nostalgia, Granada rose like a pearl placed gently upon a green carpet. Granada was unlike any other city. It was the last dream, the dream that refused to die even as everything around it began to crumble. In the 13th century, after the great cities of Al-Andalus had fallen one after another, and the Christian kingdoms pressed steadily southward, Granada stood tall. Ibn al-Ahmar founded the Nasrid kingdom, making it a refuge for scholars, artists, and refugees from Córdoba, Seville, and Toledo. They brought with them their books, calligraphy, and hopes, planting them in the soil of this new city. Granada knew it was surrounded by danger, yet chose to face fear with beauty. And so began the creation of a unique architectural masterpiece, the Alhambra Palace. It was not built for defense, but as a fortress of wonder. Its walls were not meant to repel, but to reflect light and write poetry upon stone. In the halls of the Alhambra, the wind moved freely, and water sang from fountain to fountain. Tiles gleamed like tiny stars, carvings echoed Quranic verses and lines of poetry. The place prayed through beauty, and every corner spoke of Al-Andalus, its grace, dignity, and awareness that the end might be near, yet the spirit must never abandon elegance. Granada was not just the Alhambra, it was a living city. Markets buzzed with incense and spices, minarets called to prayer. The people's eyes were filled with worry, yet never empty of hope. In its schools, scholars still studied medicine and astronomy. Amid all this beauty, the city was also filled with calculation. The rulers knew time was running short, that the Christian kingdoms advanced with determination. Yet they chose to stand firm, even if only through culture, to leave behind a mark that would endure. Granada decided to die standing, not kneeling or afraid. At night, the city slept quietly, but its heart never rested. In its corners, between torch-lit homes, life continued as if unafraid of tomorrow. In the next chapter, we will come closer to that tomorrow, to see how people lived under the Andalusian sun, between farming, trade, and family. In Al-Andalus, life was not confined to palaces or libraries. It pulsed in every home, every field, every market. Under the warm sun, people lived their days through small details, full of meaning. Life was simple, yet comfortable, organized and astonishing. In the countryside, the farmer went out at dawn with his hoe, heading toward the fields shaded by olive and pomegranate trees. The land was fertile, and water flowed gently through irrigation channels, making farming possible without depending solely on rain. Agriculture was precise, not just a livelihood, but a science. There were schedules for irrigation, specific seasons for each crop, and methods for seed preservation and grain storage. The farmer knew when to plant and when to harvest. He listened to the land as he listened to his own heart. Women were partners in everything. They gathered firewood, baked in clay ovens, and spun wool in the courtyard while children played under the grapevine trellis. The Andalusian house, even in its simplest form, had an inner harmony that respected privacy, light, and water. The courtyard in the center held a lemon tree or a rose bush and a cool jug of water. In the afternoon, the family would sit together, chatting quietly. In the city, life was more vibrant. The markets were crowded. Spice sellers displayed cinnamon and cloves. Cloth merchants called out their fabrics from Syria and Yemen. The perfumer sold dried herbs, and the baker pulled warm loaves from his oven, smiling at passers-by. Everything moved calmly, but with precision. There were systems for weights, for trade, for how people treated each other. Each craft had its own district: the blacksmiths, the carpenters, the jewelers who engraved ornaments and set them with stones. Education was present even among merchants and artisans. Many could read, memorized verses of poetry, and raised their children to love knowledge as they did their work. The Andalusian child would go to the kutab in the morning, carrying a wooden tablet inscribed with Quranic verses or lines of Arabic poetry, recite before the teacher, then return home to help his mother or play with friends under the palm trees. The call to prayer rose 5 times a day, its soft sound blending with the cries of vendors, church bells, and birdsong. The city did not sleep early. After sunset, families gathered in courtyards, chatting, sipping tea, talking about crops, kings, or traders' tales. Night in Al-Andalus was not desolate. It was gentle, like a cool breath upon a drowsy cheek. Life was not always perfect, but it was generous, a balance between work and rest, worship and pleasure, poverty and wealth. People knew how to preserve their days, to craft beauty from simplicity. And from within this quiet life emerged delicate details that adorned Al-Andalus in every corner, not only in books, but on walls, in shadows, in the way water flowed through gardens. In the next chapter, we shall draw nearer to these details, to discover how decoration became a language and how art became part of the very air. In Al-Andalus, beauty was not a luxury nor empty ornament. It was a way of life, slipping into every small detail, in the home, in the garden, even in the walls. Architecture there was not mere construction. It was a language that spoke through light and shadow, through stone and script, through water and silence. In the 9th and 10th centuries, architecture in Al-Andalus reached a level where every stone seemed to breathe. Builders no longer erected walls for shelter alone. They sculpted them to converse with the sun. Arches became the signature of the land, graceful, endless, like verses written in stone. Inside homes, courtyards open to the sky, surrounded by slender columns where water whispered and orange blossoms perfumed the air. In the mosques, geometry was not cold calculation, it was rhythm and harmony. The great mosque of Córdoba stood as the crown of that vision. Its endless forest of columns reflected the unity of diversity, the infinite within the finite. Light entered from above and broke into golden patterns across red and white arches, creating a world where time itself seemed to pause. In palaces, walls were covered with inscriptions, verses from the Quran, lines of poetry, invocations of peace and eternity. Carvings intertwined with light, and as the sun moved, the words seemed to breathe. Artists and calligraphers competed, not in vanity but in precision. Every line had a purpose, every curve had a soul. Gardens were extensions of philosophy. They were not mere ornament but reflection. The idea that paradise could exist on earth if man lived in harmony with nature. Water ran in carefully planned channels, dividing the soil like veins carrying life. Flowers were planted not at random, but by color and season, ensuring that beauty never ceased through the year. Art in Al-Andalus was never separate from life. It lived in the pattern of carpets, in the curves of pottery, in the melody of the oud and the soft recitation of poetry. Even science had its aesthetics. Astronomers built instruments with engravings so intricate they looked like jewels, and physicians wrote their treatises in calligraphy worthy of sacred texts. This was not a coincidence. In Al-Andalus, beauty was considered a reflection of divine order. To build with harmony, to write with precision, to compose with balance, all were acts of worship. And so art, science, and faith walked together, hand in hand. But as centuries passed, winds began to shift. The golden light that once filled Al-Andalus started to dim. The same diversity that had once made it strong became a source of tension. Civil wars erupted, kingdoms fractured, power dissolved into rivalry. One by one, the great cities, Toledo, Seville, Córdoba, fell. Granada remained proud yet surrounded, a last spark in the darkening sky. And when the final moment came in the year 1492, Granada surrendered. The banners of the Nasrids were lowered, and the last Muslim king, Boabdil, looked one final time at the city from the hills. Legend says his mother told him, "Weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." But in truth, he did not weep for power. He wept for a dream, for a civilization that had made light out of dust. After the fall, silence covered the palaces, yet the stones remembered. The fountains still whispered, the arches still caught the sun, as if refusing to forget. Scholars fled eastward, carrying books and instruments. Poets took with them verses that would live on in other tongues. And though the empire ended, its soul had already crossed borders. Through translations, inventions, architecture, and philosophy, the light of Al-Andalus entered Europe, seeding the Renaissance that would soon rise. Even today, when one walks through the Alhambra or stands beneath the arches of Córdoba, one can still feel that rhythm, that blend of intellect and grace, reason and faith, structure and soul. It was never merely history. It was a vision that beauty and knowledge together could make life itself sacred. And perhaps in this quiet night, as we close the doors of time, that vision still calls to us, reminding us that civilizations do not truly die. They transform into memory, into lessons, into light that travels across ages. So, let us carry a spark of that light, as they once did, and remember that every great dawn begins in darkness, but only for those who keep faith in the coming sun. That language flourished until it became part of the very identity of Al-Andalus, not something understood by reason alone, but felt by the heart. In the quiet corners of mosques, in the courtyards of homes, and on the facades of schools, the art of Islamic ornamentation spread, calm, vast, and deliberate. There were no faces, no images, only a precise geometric repetition that resembled breathing. The patterns moved in circles and interlocking squares. The more you looked, the more new order you found within, as if they had no end. Artists called it Islamic infinity, a symbolic expression of eternity, of how everything in this world is intertwined, yet in harmony. Calligraphy was the sovereign art. Letters were not merely written to be read, but to be seen and contemplated. Quranic verses and wise sayings were inscribed in Kufic, Naskh, or Thuluth scripts, adorned like flowers of light. On the walls of the Alhambra in Granada, and on the gates of mosques in Seville, the letters flowed like water, unbroken, effortless. And water itself was a vital element of Andalusian architecture, not merely a biological need, but a symbol of purity and continuity. Gardens were built with precision so that water ran between flowers and fountains, whispering softly, cooling the air, and accompanying the visitor as a dream accompanies its dreamer. In every palace, every house, every mosque, a pool was placed in the very center, as if life itself revolved around it. Shadows, too, were part of the equation. Al-Andalus was known for its heat, and so the buildings were designed to let light in gently, creating a changing painting of shadow and radiance. In the courtyards, sunlight passed through arches, drawing lines on the ground that changed every hour, as though the house itself were breathing. The high walls, the narrow corridors, the balanced arches, none of it was random. It was deep architecture, knowing how to balance beauty and comfort. Everything was measured. The carvings, the wood, the marble, the paint, even the shape of the windows and the height of the doors. The goal was not to impress the visitor, but to comfort the resident. Beauty was quiet, not loud. It entered the eyes without tiring them and settled in the heart like a kind memory. Thus, Andalusian civilization was not merely words to be read, nor sciences to be studied. It was art to be lived. A civilization that wrote itself in stone and water, leaving its mark on all who saw it. It did not depart until it had engraved its presence in architecture, as a poem engraves itself in memory. But as history's rule dictates, all beauty is vulnerable to threat. With time, internal disputes open the gates to real danger. In the next chapter, we draw closer to the moment of division, when strife began to crack the foundations of paradise. At its height, Al-Andalus seemed eternal, its cities thriving, its sciences blooming, its markets alive. Yet in the heart of that paradise, fire was slowly growing, not from without, but from within, from man's struggle with himself and his lust for power. The seditions were like tiny cracks in a great wall, unseen at first, but silently widening until everything collapsed. In the mid-11th century, after the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba, the land began to fragment into small principalities known as the taifas. Nearly every city became an independent emirate with its own ruler, army, and policy. Each built his own palace, gathered his own court, and pursued his own ambitions. They no longer saw Al-Andalus as one homeland, but as a piece to be divided. The ruler of Granada envied that of Seville. The emir of Valencia coveted Córdoba, and each sought help not from his brothers, but from his enemies in the north. Yes, it came to the point where some kings of the taifas paid tribute to the Christian kingdoms of Castile and Leon just to remain in power. Others went so far as to invite Christian armies to aid them against rival Muslim princes. It was as if sedition had blinded wisdom. Beneath these divisions, strength turned to weakness. Scholars became refugees wandering between emirates. Merchants feared the roads. People began to lose hope. Each principality built walls for itself, believing it could survive alone. There was no single enemy, only a map of shifting alliances and betrayals. Every year, new pacts opened old wounds. In 1074, Toledo fell to Alfonso VI, King of Castile, the first great shock. Toledo was not only a political capital, but a beacon of learning, and its fall was a clear message. If Al-Andalus did not unite, its end was near. Scholars cried out in warning. Poets wrote verses of sorrow, but their voices were drowned out by the swords of princes. The turmoil did not stop. It continued for decades until the Almoravids crossed from Morocco to save what could still be saved. After them came the Almohads. Yet by then, Al-Andalus had lost something more precious than armies. It had lost its unity. The internal discord, slow but deadly, extinguished the candles that once lit the world. Not because the enemy was stronger, but because the heart had divided against itself. Al-Andalus was not defeated by the sword, but by pride. Meanwhile, in the north, time time was not standing still. The Christian kingdoms that had once been fractured began to unite. Step by step they advanced, looking southward and planning. In the next chapter, we see how the rise began, how every Andalusian city became a target, while the kingdoms of the north grew stronger in silence and faith. Behind the mountains, the small Christian states, Castile, Leon, Aragon, Navarre, once poor and divided, now found a common purpose: the desire to reclaim the land. From the mid-11th century, a movement emerged that history would call the Reconquista. It was a project spanning centuries, advancing slowly but surely. Every year brought a new fortress reclaimed. Every decade, another Muslim city lost. The church in the north was not merely a religious institution, but a mind that planned and directed. Popes issued decrees encouraging the fight against Muslims, declaring it a holy crusade that granted forgiveness of sins. Thus, the wars were no longer just royal ambitions. They became a sacred cause uniting the people. In 1074 came the Great Calamity, the fall of Toledo. It was not merely a city, but a symbol. Its loss struck a deep wound in Andalusian consciousness, signaling that the balance of power was shifting decisively northward. After Toledo, the blows continued. Cities fell one after another, especially as the Christian kingdoms began signing treaties among themselves, drafting detailed maps for the gradual recovery of Al-Andalus, city by city. In 1107, the Almoravid armies clashed with the northern kingdoms at the Battle of Zalaca and won a temporary victory. But the north did not retreat. It planned for the long term, knowing that Andalusian divisions would serve it sooner or later. A naval power began to emerge, seizing control of the eastern coasts and reaching toward the Mediterranean islands. In Castile, ambitious kings such as Alfonso VIII and Ferdinand III set their eyes on Córdoba, Seville, and Granada. In 1223, Valencia fell. Then, in 1236, Córdoba itself. The defeats were no longer shocking. They had become expected. The contrast between the sides was clear. The north advanced with planning. The south retreated in confusion. But the most dangerous weapon of the northern kingdoms was not the sword. It was their spirit, their unity, their dream. They believed that time itself was on their side. In Al-Andalus, however, the dream was shrinking, and fear was creeping into every voice. In this heavy atmosphere, amid the dust of battle, the great breaking point drew near, the fall of the city that once illuminated both east and west, Córdoba. Córdoba, for centuries, the capital of spirit and intellect in Al-Andalus. A city that birthed scholars, spread books, and taught Europe how to light the night with knowledge. But in 1236, that great candle was extinguished like a lamp blown out by the wind. It began when Ferdinand III, King of Castile, decided to strike at the very heart of Al-Andalus. He no longer sought small towns or border fortresses. He wanted the city that had once mirrored civilization itself. Córdoba was no longer well fortified. Division had weakened it, its armies had dwindled, its treasury emptied. Ferdinand's army advanced step by step, crossing rivers, seizing villages, and tightening the siege. The blockade lasted for months. Inside the walls, anxiety grew, hope faded. There was no strong army to defend, no allies nearby. Every emir was busy guarding his tiny realm, forgetting that the fall of Córdoba would mark the beginning of the end. On a heavy summer morning, the gates were opened. Some accounts say a local revealed a weakness in the wall. Others claimed the garrison surrendered under hunger and fear. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Córdoba was no longer Muslim. Castilian soldiers entered like water into thirsting soil. They raised their banners on the minarets and rang the ancient church bells that had once been silenced when the mosques were built. Houses were seized, mosques turned into churches, libraries plundered. The doors of Medina Azahara, once built in the glory of Abd al-Rahman al-Nasir, were closed forever, now silent ruins. Scholars fled, writers hid, and sorrow settled in the eyes of those who remained. Córdoba did not fall merely as a city, but as a symbol, a dream that had lived for 5 centuries. Its fall was not only violent, but deeply symbolic. To lose Córdoba was to see Europe triumph, not just in war, but in memory. It was proof that even the greatest civilization can crumble when unity is forgotten, when knowledge is neglected, when division outweighs cohesion. Amid the ruins, among the cold, silent walls, some stood and wondered, how could all this vanish so swiftly? The answer lay not in the number of swords, but in the absence of unity. Yet the story was not over. One city still stood, white as snow, light as a dream, Granada. In the next chapter, we stand at her farewell, the moment when the last king wept in a quiet winter that carried the chill of the end. Granada, the city that endured for over 2 centuries after Córdoba's fall, could resist no more. Her white fortress looked upon the sky for the last time, like a bride given to a stranger who knew neither her language nor her songs. In 1492, after months of relentless siege, Abu Abdallah Boabdil, the last of the Nasrid kings, signed the Treaty of Surrender. It was not merely a signature, it was a withdrawal from history. The terms were clear. The palace would be handed over, the royal family would leave, and the Muslims of Granada would be left in peace. Or so it was said. Before handing over the keys, the young king walked through the corridors of the Alhambra. Halls that once echoed with the laughter of princes, the discussions of philosophers, the melodies of musicians. Between water and light he moved, looking upon the walls that spoke in poetry, upon the windows that once opened to blooming gardens, now dimmed with sorrow. Then he mounted his horse, followed by a small, silent procession. He left the city gates and climbed a nearby hill, now known as the Rock of Farewell. There he turned for one last look at Granada and saw not just its walls, but the glory of his ancestors, the blood of those who fought for it, the ink of those who wrote within it, and the dreams of all who once believed the city would never fall. Boabdil wept quietly, in anguish. He was not crying for himself, but for all of Al-Andalus. His mother, who had accompanied him into exile, turned to him and said the words that would echo through the centuries. "Weep like a woman for a kingdom you could not defend as a man." From that moment, Al-Andalus was Andalusian no more. The Catholic monarchs entered the palace, raised crosses upon the minarets, and began a new era, not of conquest alone, but of deliberate forgetting. After the doors of the Alhambra were closed and Boabdil withdrew, a new rule began. A cold, silent campaign known as systematic erasure. It was not a battle of swords, but of memory, against language, faith, and identity. At first, the Christian authorities respected the terms of surrender. Muslims kept their mosques and customs, though under watch. But that tolerance did not last. Gradually, pressure increased. The illusion of coexistence turned into a policy of assimilation. It began with the schools. Quranic classes were closed, Arabic teaching banned. Children who once learned the Quran and Hadith were now forced to study in Castilian and receive Christian education. The Arabic language became a mark of suspicion, and anyone who spoke it was seen as a traitor. Then came the mosques. One by one they were shut down or turned into churches. The great mosque of Córdoba became a cathedral, its walls turned into altars, its domes pierced by steeples, its minarets crowned with bells. The libraries did not escape either. In 1505, Cardinal Cisneros ordered the burning of vast collections of Muslim manuscripts in Granada's main square. It is said over 100,000 volumes were destroyed, books of medicine, philosophy, astronomy, poetry, and tafsir. It was not just the burning of paper, but the erasure of an entire history. People lived in fear. Some hid their books in walls or buried them in the earth. Others tried to adapt, changing names, wearing Christian dress. But the noose tightened. By 1500, forced conversions began. Thousands were compelled to renounce Islam. Those who refused were tortured or exiled. The converted Muslims were called Moriscos, Christians in name but Muslims in secret. They kept their faith in their hearts, spoke Arabic at home, prayed in secret, and wrote in Arabic hidden inside Christian-looking books. But even this disguise did not save them. In 1571, the Morisco rebellion erupted in the Alpujarras Mountains, a final attempt to reclaim their identity. It was crushed brutally. A few decades later, King Philip III decreed their final expulsion from Spain. In 1609, the aim was not only to end Muslim presence, but to erase the memory that they had ever been there, to obliterate their traces, rename their cities, and silence their voice in history. But the plan never fully succeeded, because history cannot be erased so easily, and the earth retains the imprint of the hands that shaped it. In the final echoes of the tale, we still hear Al-Andalus, in memory, in song, in poetry, in the eternal longing for the lost paradise. There are no more mosques raising the call to prayer, no schools teaching Arabic, no scholars writing on parchment. Yet the yearning never died. The Arab memory, though broken and exiled, remained rooted in that land once called paradise. Poetry was the first to preserve the memory. In the salons of Damascus and Baghdad, in the markets of Cairo, poets recited the names of Granada, Córdoba, and Azara as though they were capitals of a dream not yet ended. Ibn al-Khatib wrote of Al-Andalus from afar, describing her nights, her palms, her river, as if she lived in his heart more than on earth. Even those expelled to North Africa carried with them the keys to their old homes. Literal keys, kept for generations though they never returned. They hung them on walls as symbols of a suspended dream and an undying hope. In the neighborhoods of Fez and Tunis, Andalusian quarters arose, built in the same architectural style, with gardens breathing the scent of the Alhambra. And the songs crossed the sea. Andalusian melodies traveled from Granada to Tetuan, from Seville to Algiers, from Córdoba to Tunis, sung in the same modes of Hijaz, Rast, and Nahawand. The oud never forgot its first tune. Even today, Andalusian verses are sung at weddings and festivals, trying to echo a sound lost for centuries. And the language? The language did not die. It merely hid. Many Arabic words remain in Spanish, like fragments of an age that refused to vanish. Aceite from zait, oil, azúcar from sukar, sugar, algebra from al-jabr, mesa from maida, table. They live within the Spanish tongue, often unnoticed, like buried stars. At the end of this long story, we do not close the book of Al-Andalus. We leave it open. Perhaps whoever reads it one day may find within it what could protect his own civilization from falling, and what may help memory keep its roots when places are lost and only longing remains.